This is the RPG Crawler, and it is time to continue with my look at various OSR retro clones, this time with one that I've been somewhat familiar with on and off through the years, Osric, or Old School Reference and Index Compilation, currently maintained by Stuart Marshall. Originally created back in 2006 with the revisions in 2009 and 2013, it is available as a free PDF as well as a few print-on-demand formats from within Lulu. I should note that some of these are of older versions. I did acquire a spiral-bound print-on-demand lay-flat version, and although I will address its construction briefly, the variety of formats means that the focus of this review will be on the rules themselves. Osric is, at its core, a simulacrum of D&D or AD&D First Edition. Specifically, it was originally devised to offer a system through which AD&D-compatible adventures could be offered to a modern audience using the OGL-derived material. Since then, the revisions have shaped it into an eminently playable system that seeks to capture that first edition aesthetic. As always, I'll go over the actual product myself and then go into my thoughts and evaluation at the end. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the physical copy I got, but suffice to say that I did pick up the A5 lay-flat edition, which doesn't match the form factor of any other thing I've got, I've ever purchased. It's spiral-bound, it's of compact size with full-color cover, but black and white interior. With a sheer number of pages, this ends up being actually a decent decision, and it does make it rather easy to reference pretty much any page and have the book lay flat open for ease of use during play. I can't say that I'll actively be seeking a similar format in other products, but I'm not displeased with it. The freely available PDF is well bookmarked and is currently available at least in a version that is based on the same form factor as the print version. In terms of content, there are 412 pages, with the interior mostly presented in a straightforward two-column format, interspersed with tables. Most applicable tables span both columns for ease of reference. There's the usual black and white illustrations for interior artwork, but they are far fewer and further between in Osric, of smaller size and scope, generally fitting into a single column with a few exceptions, and seem more like filler. The main exception to this, of course, are those illustrations in the monsters section, although even there, only a subset of creatures have illustrations associated with them. All in all, this serves to leave the focus on the rules themselves rather than the artistic presentation. The book itself is divided into 6 chapters, followed by appendices and support material. In Osric's case, the appendices are simply the compiled tables throughout the rest of the book and some player character sheets, so no oddly placed supplementary rules here. Instead, the rules are organized clearly into chapters: creating a character, spells, how to play the first time, dungeons, towns, and wilderness, monsters, and then treasure. Osric begins with a quick explanation of common RPG terms, then a preamble from the current maintainer Stuart Marshall, as well as an introduction from the original compiler Matthew Finch. It then jumps right into Chapter 1, creating a character. There's a lot of leeway given to the GM to decide just how to generate the stats, with no one way really assumed. Osric uses the classic 6 abilities, arranged in 2nd edition and later order of Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. Generally, the ability bonuses are comparable with those found in 1st edition, except that all the tables go up to 19. There are a few other minor differences as well, but all in all, ability scores are well explained, and as one would expect for a compatible power scale. Races follow and cover dwarves, elves, gnomes, half-elves, halflings, and half-orcs, as well as humans. Each race has a summary of its special abilities in place, starting ages for the various classes, a list of minimum and maximum ability scores, as well as any level limits. Again, this generally follows the system that it seeks to emulate, except it's stated more clearly. There's also a lack of the difference between male and female characters that was present in AD&D First Edition, and I understand why that was taken out. Character classes follow, with each class getting a full description, a summary of minimum ability scores, hit dice, alignments allowed, how that class qualifies for an experience bonus, armor and weapons permitted, weapon proficiency slots gained, and a penalty for non-proficiency with the weapons, whether that class can specialize in a weapon, and then descriptions of each ability the class gets in turn. There are also associated tables as needed, with each class at least getting a full experience table, saving throw table, and 2-hit table, and additional tables when specific abilities require it, such as thieving abilities. Classes include the Assassin, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Illusionist, Magic User, Paladin, Ranger, and Thief. There's a distinct lack of Monk and Bard in Osric for various reasons. Each class's abilities have been properly formalized, cleaving as close to the original class descriptions as possible, but using OGL-related material where necessary. There are minor numerical differences in some tables and in the experience advancement, but all in all they are negligible. There's rules for multiclassing and dual classing, which are pretty much identical to the AD&D rules. Likewise, the alignment system uses the by now standard 2-axis 9-alignment system of law, chaos, good, evil. Equipment is covered in the character creation section as well, and has a pretty thorough list of available gear. Osric follows the modern system of putting the equipment's encumbrance here rather than squirreling it away in some alternate place like in the original game. Osric does seem to do away with the various weapon types versus armor tables as well, simplifying that aspect of the game. Chapter 1 concludes with optional height and weight tables for the various races. Chapter 2 covers spells. There's some brief descriptions of spell memorization rules, which very much follow the old school methods, a discussion of spell scrolls, and then the lists of spells by class. For the most part, the spells in the lists are identical to the ones in the basic Player's Handbook offerings from AD&D with none of the expansion books. There are a few instances where spells' names have been changed to be in line with the SRD names, but not many. Each spell is thoroughly described with a name, whether they are reversible or not, class and school of magic, level, range, duration, area of effect, and what types of components it has, casting time, saving throw, and then the actual description of what the spell does. Although restated, these spells are pretty much on par with the power level and effects from their original versions, although I will admit that certain ones have been clarified where their original descriptions were slightly unclear. I do like the fact that each spell has its class or spell type listed in the description, because even though the pages themselves aren't labeled with what classes of spells are on that page, the spell type in the spells themselves makes it easy enough to navigate at least. Chapter 3 is how to play, actually how to play the first time, but honestly it's just the basic rules of the game. It starts with time and movement, which follow the usual 1-minute round, 10-minute timescale, with movement being listed in feet rather than the original version of measuring them in inches and then scaling them depending on where you're at. There's some discussion of encumbrance rules and carrying capacities, then talk of experience. Like many old school games, Osric awards XP for treasure obtained as well as monsters slain. There's also an assumption of training time and trainers necessary to level up that's built right into the rules, although the way this is handled is pretty loose. There's also an optional rule to add a random variability to experience required for each level. The chapter goes on to cover lighting and vision types, falling rules, and item saving throws next. The falling rules use the clarified falling rules from Unearthed Arcana, wherein falling damage is cumulative per 10 feet rather than linearly scaled, which can result in huge amounts of damage very quickly. Combat rules are then covered in depth, and aside from the lack of weapon types versus armor, it is, from what I can tell, pretty much identical to the AD&D rules. Now, I say from what I can tell because I admit that I was sometimes confused by the original first edition rules back in the day. Yes, I know, I'm kind of shooting down my old school cred here, but I often used simplified versions of those rules when I played it, and it was actually only when I actually read through the Osric combat rules that I went back to reread the first edition rules more thoroughly to properly understand them. And I'm still not sure I ever did. Osric collects the major combat modifiers you can encounter that might affect attack rolls in one easy reference place, which I appreciate, and then it goes on to cover returning undead rules. Damage, death, and healing rules follow. They're pretty standard with a negative hit point value, albeit one that results in serious wounds and a long-term recuperation. Morale rules follow, very useful for limiting the duration of combat, and then there's a brief coverage of poison, disease, and insanity. These aren't as in-depth as the rules presented in the original first edition DMG, but they do the job well enough. Pretty extensive rules on hirelings and henchmen follow, including prices for various sorts of experts and mercenaries, then rules for hiring henchmen and henchman loyalty. The next section in the same chapter covers the various exploration rules, just guidelines on the cycle of play, the individual rules for dealing with various exploration tasks such as dealing with doors and traps, mapping, etc. A similar section briefly follows, dealing with wilderness exploration, and then there's some aerial combat and maneuvering rules. After some talk of other places to adventure, such as towns and other planes, there's a small sample dungeon with a key and sample playstation. Chapter 4 covers dungeons, towns, and wilderness, not the rules for exploring them, but rather for creating them. The chapter starts with some guidelines and tables on how to create and stock dungeons, including random dungeon rules akin to the ones in the original appendix of the GMG. There's tables for handling random encounters in the dungeon, and then random NPCs and random urban encounters, before dealing with random wilderness encounters. Basically, the bulk of the chapter is tables designed to make random content generation a little bit easier. Chapter 5 covers monsters and starts with a description of the format of the upcoming monster entries, then a brief description of monstrous spellcasters. The various monster entries follow, with each one listed by name, frequency, number encountered, size, movement, armor class, hit dice, attacks, damage per attack, any special attacks and defenses, magic resistance, chance that they're in a lair, intelligence, alignment, and level/experience value, followed by a text description of the monster and any special tactics that they may use. Rather than treasure classes as you might find in older school D&D, they just list the chance in each type of individual treasure appearing in that particular monster's individual or horde stats. The stats overall are well organized, and the way that treasure is listed under each monster allows for more variability in the types of treasure, effectively customizing them for each individual creature. One thing that should be noted is that Osric does not simply place all of the monsters alphabetically, but instead separates them out by category, like humanoids, giants, dragons, fiends, and so on. Although there is a large general monster catch-all for ones that just don't have a category. The final chapter of the book is Treasure, and aside from the lacking treasure categories, it follows what you might have come to expect from classic D&D style treasure tables, with guidelines on treasure hoards not associated with monsters, and then random tables for types of jewelry, magic items, and then magic item descriptions. This includes rules for potion miscability, sentient swords, cursed items, and brief rules for artifacts. Most of the classic AD&D era magic items from the basic DMG that aren't product identity have been included in all of their full glory. I will admit that there seem to be a few additional items included to flesh out the tables. The end of the book closes out with all of the various tables presented in the book in a nice appendix, and then character record sheets with an index and then legal notices thereafter. So, my experience with Osric has mostly revolved not around using the system itself to run games, but rather as a handy reference for the system which it seeks to clone. And I fully understand and recognize that it is its own standalone system, and it actually seems to work very well as such. There are differences, yes, especially in some of the most esoteric and underutilized rules from the first edition era, but by and large, the core of the system is pretty faithful to the original rules. I, for one, found it actually much easier to understand and reference than my first edition books, to the point where I was actually going to introduce someone to, first edition, that style of play, or if I was running an adventure from that era, might actually go to Osric first over AD&D, even though I have most of the books. At least if I was dealing with people who weren't familiar with either system. I can also personally attest that I find it useful to use as a planning tool for designing adventures when I don't want to lug around the original books. And yes, I know there's PDFs available for the original game now, but I'm getting to be an old man, and I like the feel of a book for quick reference, rather than just a PDF all the time. Osric is also much easier to navigate. The name states that it's a reference and index compilation, and to put simply, it is. Some of the OSR systems that I've covered in the past focus a lot on artistic presentation, and while that's all well and good, sometimes you just want to know where a rule is as quickly as possible, and on that end, Osric does a very good job. I do miss some of the things that it lacks. Not the psionic rules, no, I rarely use those when running AD&D First Edition, but I do miss things like the Bard and, of course, the Monk class. Some of the more in-depth day-to-day rules that you'd find in the DMG, such as expanded disease rules, would also have been useful to have, but not critical. The simplified versions in Osric get the job done. I know there's a fair number of people that are familiar with Osric that prefer the prior revisions, and I have to say that I respect that. I personally don't have a preference one way or the other, but this is the version more commonly available now, so that's why I'm covering it. For freely available, complete rule sets that allow for a play of old-school AD&D modules while being easy to reference and learn, it's pretty solid. It does tend to cleave more closely to the original rules than, say, Advanced Labyrinth Lord or a similar system, and it doesn't spend a whole lot of time on holding a new GM's hand. You have guidelines, and you have hints in there. Plenty of random tables, but Osric really does seem to cater to more experienced GMs than some of the other OSR games might in that regard, at least the ones that I've covered. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. The most important part about Osric, I think, is that it had a role in being one of the early OSR systems. Along with a couple of other systems, Osric was part of the first wave of old-school Renaissance systems back in the mid-2000s during the 3rd edition era, and it helped set the groundwork for the appreciation of that early RPG aesthetic by an entirely new generation of players. And if only for that, I can recommend that those few fans of the OSR that still haven't checked out Osric should at least give it a thumb through. After all, as a freely available PDF, there's really little to lose. And on that note, I'm going to call it here. Still have some pretty solid OSR systems to look at, but I'll try to vary them up with some other products that I'd like to review. As always, I'll put some links to where you can pick them up in the description below. For now, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.